Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am Andrew Langer, your host. And if you're listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms that are out there, you know, you can always catch us on our YouTube channel to see what's happening in studio. If you're watching us on YouTube, you know, you can take us with you wherever you want to go on one of those fine podcast platforms that's out there. Subscribe, leave a review, leave a like, leave a comment. Let us know what you're thinking. We really appreciate the feedback that you're giving us on the show. And of course, let your friends and family members know, and your family members' friends know that you're watching or listening to, or both, the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Really excited to bring our guest on today. His name is Tony Abboud. He is the executive director of the Vapor Technology Association. He is a government relations expert and litigator with 25 years of experience in grassroots organizing, politics, state lobbying, as well as his courtroom experience. He spent the last decade defending vapor companies and companies in other heavily regulated industries against government overreach, issues that are very near and dear to my heart. He brings his unique set of lobbying, legal, political, and governmental experience to developing the strategic solutions that will enable vapor companies to succeed in a regulated world, and in a world where there are two very different competing regulatory environments. Tony, thank you so very much for joining us today. And let's talk about this. I mean, let's talk about the vapor and the vaping industry. Let's talk about the challenges that industry has faced, especially in the last decade. Well, first of all, start off with talking a little bit about the history of the products and you know, how we got to where we are.
Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew, for having me on. We're very excited to be able to talk to you today. This is a fascinating issue, and I'm eager to share kind of my insights with your audience.
Great.
The way e-cigarettes started basically was there was an inventor. His name was Han Lick in China, and his father had died from smoking cigarettes, and he set about coming up with an alternative. He said that we have to be able to invent a technology that doesn't that provides a less harmful alternative to smoking cigarettes, because we all know how deadly cigarette smoking is. And that was kind of where the product originated. And the fundamental aspects of the product are very simple. They take an e-liquid that contains nicotine, and they heat that liquid, but not to a point where you are burning it or where it reaches the level of combustion.
Sure.
And therefore, it releases nicotine, which is what keeps a smoker smoking.
Right.
Public health scientists, the FDA leaders have all recognized that people smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar and the carcinogens and the chemicals that are found in combustible cigarettes.
Right.
So this is a major sea change in technology that is coming up with a solution to a 19th century agricultural addiction, and so that's where it started.
So that's where it started. So, and it's one of those things where there was incredible amounts of popularity almost immediately for the industry. And obviously you've got folks who believe in this issue of the precautionary principle, something that I just talked about with somebody on another podcast, which sort of turns traditional regulation on its head and makes you have to prove that something is safe, instead of the way that we've always gone about doing it, which is to sort of demonstrate risks and sort of let the marketplace sort of figure things out. In this heavily regulated environment or heavily regulating environment, of course, the folks who live their lives in regulation, they've always had a beef with vaping, as the possibility of a safer alternative to cigarette smoking.
Yeah, that's true, and this has set up the big dialectic between those invested stakeholders, whether they be NGOs or people with political ideologies or certain industry players, versus the consumers and the small businesses which have adopted these products.
Yeah.
It is really interesting because when people are finally able to quit smoking, they are released from many times decades of an addiction to a very deadly product.
Right.
And this is what makes the vaping community so fervent in and passionate about its defense of these products. And it's what actually has caused the growth of an independent vaping industry in this country. A lot of people who quit smoking for the first time after trying to quit for over the course of 10, 20 years and always regressing back to smoking, this was the first product that worked for them. And many of them opened vape shops because they wanted to share this with the public. And that's an extremely important thing. However, the ideologues always have tried to look at this from the precautionary principle, as you were just talking about. And the standards that have been implemented for getting this less harmful product into the market now far exceed what is required to get a much more dangerous product like a cigarette into the market. And so the world has turned on its head in large part because these ideological divides have existed, which have just been driven by bureaucracies, and in this case, the FDA. And that is harming public health. It's harming the consumers and smokers who are trying to get off smoking cigarettes.
Let's talk about this because you deal with other heavily regulated industries, and we're going to stick closely to the vaping side of it. And I want to talk about the business aspects and the small business impacts of things. But one of the things that we've been talking about over the years, now my dad's an environmental and occupational scientist. And so at a very early age, I was taught about the issue of comparative risk assessment, which is this idea of making public policy determinations and accounting for the risks and figuring out which is the less risky thing to do amongst a series of public policy choices. For whatever reason, regulators and the folks who are pushing for greater amounts of bureaucracy, they don't like comparative risk assessment. They don't like this idea of making choices. But this is an inherent aspect of both the policymaking side of this, but also for industries like the ones you're dealing with. Talk about why this is important, the issue of comparing, contrasting the risks of the various public policy decisions.
Well, it's pretty straightforward, I think. Look, American consumers will always choose products that they are interested in trying. They are trying everything these days, from cannabis to CBD to other types of homeopathic type products, and so we have a public that is just always looking for something that they will make them feel better in some way. Now, the reality is that nicotine has been around for a very long time, and the science of nicotine shows that it actually has beneficial properties. And there is a reason that people who are suffering, for example, from mental health conditions or other substance abuse disorders disproportionately smoke cigarettes, and their life expectancy is disproportionately impacted by the fact that they're smoking as opposed to the underlying disorders.
Right.
So when we talk about continuum of risk, there is no question anymore. The science is extremely well settled that when compared to a cigarette, the e-cigarette or an electronic vaping product is on a quantum level different type of scale. We are talking about at the lowest end of risk on the continuum, much closer to the patch and the gum that the FDA has already approved, which contain nicotine. It's just a different way of ingesting that nicotine. And so this is where the medical establishment, the public health groups have failed, because they have refused to acknowledge and then act in accordance with the continuum of risk, and have chose to try to regulate this dramatically less harmful, less toxic, and less risky product as if it was had the same risk profile as a deadly cigarette. And that doesn't make any sense.
Right, and let's talk about some of the numbers here, because, obviously the numbers of smokers have gone down in America, and we could talk about the role that vaping has played in this. But in terms of this issue of cancer risk and heart disease risk and the other things that are associated with the smoking and the dirty smoke that comes out of tobacco smoking when you inhale it, right? Listen, to me, it was always a very simple thing. If you're inhaling particulate matter down into your lungs, there are going to be problems that are out there. And it's not to say that asbestos is the same as tar from tobacco or what have you. But again, there are different levels here. So let's talk about some of those numbers, both in the United States over the last, right? So when was the first vaping product introduced, the first e-cigarette introduced in the U.S.,
Really,
Tony?
around 2010.
Okay, so we're talking almost 15 years, so almost a decade and a half. Let's talk about the numbers and how they've changed in that decade and a half.
Yeah. Well, what we saw was over the course of the last couple decades, smoking was continually but slowly declining in this country. And there could be a number of reasons for that in terms of public education, greater attention paid to it, greater efforts by the government to inform consumers about the dangers and the risks of smoking. But then something funny happened. When e-cigarettes came onto the scene in a major way, all of a sudden that decades-long trend downward dropped steeply. In other words, and public health scientists have looked at this, and they attribute the fact that e-cigarettes were the primary change in terms of policy or availability that could explain why all of a sudden smoking rates decline dramatically differently than in the years prior to the introduction of e-cigarettes. And that in and of itself has saved American lives.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about this because, you talk about the issue of nicotine addiction.
Yeah.
It's not just that, right? I mean, now I've never been a smoker. I've smoked cigars on occasion, never actually smoked a cigarette or anything else like that. I've never tried a vaping product. But there is, from what I understand from smokers, there's a certain mechanic to it, right? The holding of the tobacco product and the putting the nicotine delivery product in your mouth, the vapor itself, the smoke, what have you. All of these things are associated with the attractive nature, I suppose, of this. And so an e-cigarette mimics that in a way so that it makes it not just easier, but also it deals with all of the other ancillary issues that are attributed to the habit of smoking. Talk about this?
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, I think that anybody that has smoked and tried to quit knows how difficult it is to quit smoking. Hence, the stories of anybody you talk to who's tried to quit. I mean, it's going to be hard to find somebody who did it on the first time that they ever tried. And so, what we found is that quitting smoking is very individualized. And there are other aspects to it, like the oral fixation, the hand to mouth, the inhalation, right? Makes a difference when smokers are transitioning away from a cigarette because their bodies have been accustomed to getting the nicotine, but through the format of inhalation. And that's why it's important. For example, while many people have tried to say, oh, well, we should have only low nicotine products. Well, again, it's the nicotine that the body is craving. And so if you're going to entice somebody off of a cigarette, you can't have a nicotine product that is so low that it just doesn't satisfy them. There's and the same. So you have to deal with the real world implications.
Hold on, Tony. Otherwise, you got somebody who literally is covering their body in nicotine patches, and Lord knows we don't want that.
Well, that's just it. And again, it brings us back to the fundamental point, which is that the FDA has basically, because of big pharma, has authorized people to use nicotine in a patch or a gum format as much and for as long as they want. In other words, the FDA has said, nicotine is not the problem. Go ahead and use as much as you want. It used to say, if you start smoking again, you must stop using the patch and the gum. But in 2013, ironically, that rule was changed by the FDA, and they said, you know what, we're going to get rid of those warnings. People should use as much nicotine as they want, even if they keep smoking cigarettes. So this brings us back to the format. Now, all of a sudden, we have a much more effective format that is much more relatable to the individual who's trying to quit smoking. And it is one of the key reasons that people can attribute the success rate with respect to e-cigarettes. They're used to it, they know it, and they get their nicotine, and they're not inhaling all the tar and the carcinogens.
Let's talk about the changing regulatory environments and why elections matter. We're not going to get into the partisan politics part of it, but we can talk about sort of the different approaches.
Yeah.
You're talking about what happened in 2013 under the Obama administration, which was, a pro-nanny state sort of a situation where they're, making choices. And I remember this. I was teaching in a public policy program at a university in the fall of 2019. And there was this initial panic over vaping and counterfeit vaping products. I want to talk about this because the Trump administration started to go down a road. And I remember talking with my class about the issue of policy being made in a crisis. But then they did something interesting. And then walk us through sort of how we went from the Obama administration into the first Trump administration and then into the Biden administration. And then we'll talk about what we're hoping for in the next Trump administration. But talk about sort of that journey across the spectrum there.
Well, I was at the center of all of this. Like, we woke up one day and we realized that all of a sudden there were these news reports of people that were vaping and also going to the hospital, getting sick and dying. And it actually was a real public health crisis at the time. What we found out, though, very quickly, very early on, like, for example, the New York State Department of Health discovered that this was not an issue that involved nicotine vaping products. It was an issue that involved black market cannabis vaping products.
Interesting.
And as a result of that, what they found was that the products themselves were being adulterated by basically drug dealers. They called them the William Whites of Wisconsin. They had put onto the market products that contained an oil called vitamin E acetate. This was determined, Andrew, very early on in the fall of 19 by the New York State Department of Health. But the media did not distinguish between black market cannabis products, which have nothing to do with our companies and our products. They instead used this narrative as a way to attack flavored vaping products. So there was a media stir, a frenzy, where all of a sudden the focus became, well, we must get rid of flavored nicotine products because of this black market cannabis problem. None of it made sense, again, right? This is to your point of trying to make policy during a crisis. And we pushed back very, very hard on this in trying to correct the record. The CDC refused to correct the record. The FDA did speak clearly, but not very loudly on this issue. But what happened next was we saw a lot of governors in various states deciding that they needed to all of a sudden ban flavored vaping products because Mike Bloomberg went on television and said, we have to ban flavored vaping products to deal with this lung crisis. And it became all of a sudden a completely different animal. Because now you're talking about really ending an entire industry that has grown in the United States, trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, at least as it relates to nicotine. So go ahead.
No, but real quick, let's talk about this issue. Who was pushing this, right? Let's sort of peel it back a little bit and tell us, because again, it's not that all of a sudden the public health folks woke up in the middle of the night and this was an issue. Talk about what's pushing this issue, or who was pushing this issue.
Well, there are numerous public health groups or non-governmental organizations that have railed against tobacco, the big tobacco companies, for many years. And once e-cigarettes started to come onto the scene, they realized that this was the next enemy that they could go after, right? And many folks in Washington, D.C., particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, and at the state level, would listen to these groups and say, "Oh my gosh, this is the next product that big tobacco is going to hook our kids on." Okay.
Oh no, big time. Sorry, I shouldn't make fun. This is a serious podcast. I apologize. Go ahead.
But I mean, that was the narrative, and there was an enormous amount of money, right, that was being pushed. I mean, Michael Bloomberg announced on CBS that he was going to pledge $120 million of his own money to end flavored e-cigarettes in the middle of this crisis that did not involve flavored e-cigarettes, but they tied the two together, and the media was happy to run with it. So, as I was saying, all of a sudden there became a very public push to get rid of flavored e-cigarettes. And the FDA decided now's the time. We are going to ask President Trump to ban all flavors. And at first, he made the announcement that that was going to happen. But then a couple months later, he did something a lot smarter. And what he did was he said, we're not going to ban all flavors and get rid of these products that so many small businesses in this country are selling and relying on, and get rid of the products that are helping adults quit smoking. If we want to protect kids, we're going to raise the age to 21 to buy all tobacco products.
Right.
And we championed that with the White House and with Congress, Andrew, because we knew that was a much smarter and also common sense public policy solution than simply banning flavors, which adults love, particularly when it comes to quitting smoking. Because just as you were saying before, as we were talking about before, it is hard to quit. The flavors, or what the science is showing, are helping keep adults interested in the product and keep them interested in different versions of the product, and that aids in their quitting journey. So when President Trump, though, decided and said on, I think it was November 22nd, almost 4 years ago, 5 years ago today, he said that we're going to raise the age to 21 to protect kids, but we're also going to preserve a big section of the flavored vaping market in order to protect the U.S. vaping industry. And so, you know what's happened since then? The youth vaping rate in this country has plummeted 71%.
Wow. I mean, that's amazing. It really is amazing.
It is amazing. Yeah. And this is why, again, you don't make bad public policy choices during a crisis. He saw through the good and the bad of the choices that were being presented to him, and he picked the right choice, which was raise the age to 21. If we want to protect kids, then let's make it illegal, like it is now for cannabis, for anybody under 21 to purchase, like it was for alcohol for anybody under 21 to purchase. Let's not go to these extreme calls to ban products. There are plenty of smarter ways to regulate. He made an important decision that has had a positive impact on public health at a critical time.
Plus, there must have been this recognition that if you go to do an out-and-out ban for a product that, millions of people are using, that just creates the very black market that you're trying to defeat, and it creates its own set of risks. And again, this is vitally important to sort of understand these things. Let me ask you about this, because this came up. Is there a problem with regards to black market or counterfeit products coming in from other countries? We don't have to get specific unless you want to about countries, because I've talked about this with folks in the industry. Want to get your perspective. I mean, black market and counterfeit products obviously have an economic impact, but are there public health risks as well from this? Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Okay, so in the 15 years that vaping products have been on the market, and for a big chunk of time, they were completely unregulated, right?
Yeah.
We have never had a public health crisis. The crisis we talked about had nothing to do with nicotine vaping products. These are not overly complicated products, right? They are 4 basic constituents in the products. And so from a baseline standard, I do not have ongoing concerns and haven't seen any evidence that products are being brought into the country that are in any way, dangerous. We've heard a lot about that in the media, but they're simply, again, just false representations and misrepresentations that don't really pertain to the reality. But to your point earlier, you are correct. Bans will create an influx of products in any marketplace because, again, consumers will always demand and always find a way to get what they want. And after President Trump took his action and said, we're not going to ban all flavored vaping products, the next administration decided to come in and take every step they could to do just that. We are living right now under a de facto ban on flavored e-cigarettes. And this is not just what I'm saying. This is what the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit has said.
Now, hold on for a second, because that's ironic given that the FDA tried to go down the road of banning flavored tobacco products, like actual smoking tobacco products, and they pulled back from that ban, and we all saw it as being cravenly political. So it's interesting that we're under a de facto ban from something that is, from an objective public health perspective, less harmful. That's crazy, but that's where we are. So talk more about it, Tony. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine. I mean, you're spot on. I mean, there are states in this country where it is harder to get a flavored, less harmful vaping product than it is to get a flavored combustible product.
It's crazy.
It is crazy.
Yeah.
And again, this is the world in which we are living. And so what the FDA, though, has done to date has been to create this market scenario where they have said all flavored vaping products cannot come into the market. All flavored nicotine pouches cannot come into the market. Everything is illegal, according to the FDA, unless we have first authorized it ourselves. And you know how many products?
Principle turns the whole concept back on its own. I'm sorry, Tony. Go ahead.
Well, do you know how many products they've authorized?
I would say probably zero.
I can hold them in two hands, basically.
Yeah,
that's it. And that same FDA, Andrew, has in the last 2.5 years only, under the current FDA commissioner and the current CTP director, Brian King, have authorized over 900 new cigarettes for the U.S. market and almost 2,000 combustible tobacco products.
Amazing.
So explain to me the world in which it makes more sense for an FDA to fast track deadly cigarettes into the marketplace and slow walk less harmful flavored nicotine products.
Yeah, I mean, again, it gets into who is pushing these issues, and this is obviously part of the problem is the issue of cronyism and the more power the government has in any particular marketplace and the ability to pick winners and losers in that marketplace. So with that in mind, then, as we said, elections have consequences. We've got a new administration coming in. So you've got your work cut out for you. Talk a little bit about where this is going to go. What is on the agenda moving forward? I just put together in my other public policy job my list of 100 different regulatory recommendations. I have to go back and look to see if any of this was on there. If not, it should be. But talk generally about what you guys aim to do, and then talk with some specificity about what you're looking to do.
So the Vapor Technology Association, from the start, set out our mission back in 2015, which was to advocate for a rational, science-based regulation of e-cigarette products.
Well, the science.
We have not diverted from that at all in our entire history. And what we have been pushing and what we are looking for is just that out of the new administration. What we have in the current administration, the way that they have created this regulation, they've made this gargantuan pre-market tobacco application regulation, okay? And in that regulation, they didn't tell companies exactly what science they needed to provide. They didn't tell companies what are the standards for the scientific tests that should be conducted. They did not tell companies how the agency would evaluate the scientific research that is provided to them. What they basically said was, we're interested in a whole bunch of these scientific areas, so please provide us this information. And they listed category upon category upon category, okay? Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because there is no clarity in terms of what actually is required to get a less harmful nicotine product on the market, period. And again, it's not just me saying that. The Reagan-Udall Foundation, which was is an independent body created by Congress, which the FDA commissioner in 2022 asked to review the Center for Tobacco Products tobacco regulation. They came out and said, you got a problem here.
Right.
The AP called the report a blistering report, okay? And what they said is companies don't know what is required, and more
Right.
importantly, you haven't told us or the public how you are interpreting it. So what ended up happening was in fact political, Andrew.
Of
It was
course.
in mid 2021 that the acting commissioner had gone on in front of Congress, and she was told, you must ban Juul, you must ban all flavored e-cigarettes. And she was confronted and berated, and it was not a good showing, frankly, for the acting commissioner. It was
Right.
terrible showing, okay? In the next 2 weeks, she got personally involved with the issue. This is an FDA commissioner getting involved with a very detailed, specific scientific issue. And they changed the rules of the game. What they did is they said, thank you all for submitting the applications 10 months ago. We are now going to change what is required to be in those applications,
Wow.
but not give you the opportunity to actually supplement those applications. And that's how it started. It started with a congressional hearing, a backroom change in what the requirements were under that regulation, and then, of course, decisions which then denied, as they like to say now, 99.9% of all applications.
Yeah.
So that's landed the FDA in court in 80 different lawsuits for obvious reasons. And one of those cases is actually going to be in front of the Supreme Court with oral arguments on December 2nd.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And that case is important because it was the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in an en banc decision that really eviscerated the FDA's process. It opened the opinion with the following statement. Over several years, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration sent manufacturers of flavored e-cigarettes on a wild goose chase.
Right.
Okay. And so we are going to see what the Supreme Court has to say about the FDA's conduct in the context of this set of applications that are involved in the lawsuit. But the bigger problem needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed quickly. We think that the regulation, to answer your question about what needs to happen, we think the regulation needs to be shelved, and we think that the regulation needs to be replaced with a clear, a transparent, and affordable tobacco product standard, which will then set out the clear scientific requirements in order to get these products approved and on the market.
And it's one of those things where, listen, obviously you've got a Supreme Court that is predisposed to having greater clarity in terms of the regulatory process, greater transparency. But on the other hand, the timing couldn't be more perfect just in terms of this changeover because, Melissa, while we'd love to have the Supreme Court come down and make it really clear that this kind of behavior is not tolerated, there's also the proximate problem of actually getting the reforms done that need to get done. The two things sort of happening simultaneously, I guess it can't be helped here. I'm assuming that once the new administration comes in, this is a task of the prime directive is to deal with this, is it not?
Well, addressing this issue really addresses so many of the themes and concerns
Right.
that the incoming administration has talked about, and really will provide a remarkably important course correction. We cannot forget, in the last 4 years, 2 million people in this country have died from cigarette smoking. In the last 4 years, we've had between 16 and 30 million Americans that are suffering from chronic disease.
Yeah.
Cigarette smoking is the number one cause of chronic disease in this country. And that is something that the incoming health secretary has said needs to end. We have to take on chronic diseases in this country, and this one should be at the top of the list.
And then as a general principle in terms of regulatory policy, this issue of transparency and accountability and certainty. I mean, let's talk about the small businesses. Let's come back to this now.
Yeah.
How many small businesses, and I tend to define small businesses as businesses with 20 employees or less, how many small vaping retailers are there out there? What are we talking about in terms of a sector that needs to get this guidance out of the federal government?
So the small businesses in this country, like I said, grew up and developed and set up and grew independent of the large tobacco players. There is an entire independent distribution chain. And when I say independent, I mean independent of the traditional cigarette company distribution chain that had controlled the way all products are being delivered. And we have looked at the numbers, and right now we have approximately 10,000 vape shops in this country, spread out all over the country. Now, that number has gone down since 2018, in large part because of the manner in which the government is attempting to regulate. But we also have a number of other American businesses which are suppliers to this industry. You have a number of smoke shops that sell a combination. These are all small business owners, mom and pop shops that employ hundreds of thousands of American workers and generate an enormous amount of economic impact for the United States. Our last study put it at about $17.6 billion in total economic impact of the vaping industry. So we are talking about a not only real companies and real jobs, we're talking about people and the livelihoods that they have built. Now, this FDA remarkably has decided, once it started getting hit in court, to turn its attention to enforcement. And so they have been using the Department of Justice and now Customs and Border Protection to go after small businesses.
Yeah.
I mean, when the Department of Justice is filing lawsuits against a small business in federal court, one has to question, is that really a good use of government resources? And I think, again, the incoming administration probably should look at that skeptically. The other factor is, when you think about the fact that the FDA has now leveraging and using Customs and Border Protection to focus on and to stop, of all things, flavored nicotine products coming into the market, Andrew.
Right.
When I do believe that the concerns of Americans and the concerns of the incoming administration are that the Customs and Border Protection should probably be more focused on stopping fentanyl, human trafficking, and illegal immigrants coming into the country. So when you think about what this issue means to an incoming administration, it really hits on so many of the themes, including just the notion of rolling back regulations that make no sense. And this one makes no sense. It's unworkable. And also in pursuing an actual science-based tobacco product standard, you eliminate any concerns about the products, the way that they're manufactured, about their safety. And you know that the conflicts of interest that have kind of hampered FDA for years and years and years get taken out of the process, because now we actually have a true scientific standard. We don't have an FDA Center for Tobacco Products chief just sitting back and making decisions on which companies he wants to win and which companies he wants to lose.
Yeah, the more power government has to pick winners and losers in any particular marketplace, the more the opportunities for corruption there are. Tony, talk a little bit about your background, how you got involved in these things, and then we'll talk a little bit about your outside interests. But tell us a little bit more about you and your story.
So I've been a practicing lawyer for, I think you said 25 years at the top of the show. It's actually more than that. We're at 30 years now. And you can probably see the gray. But in any event, and I, worked at a variety of law firms. I've done political work. I've done government work. And I came to this issue in 2010 and have and then when e-cigarettes, and I first got involved with the e-cigarette side of the marketplace in around 2013, this was unlike anything else I had worked on, right? When you're a lawyer in a courtroom, you're basically arguing over money, right? Both sides, that's it. When you are, lobbying at the state level, like I did for many years on a variety of issues, it comes down to effectively money. This was an issue that really, really gripped me because I saw early on the importance of making sure that these products are properly regulated in this country, that they are honestly and thoughtfully spoken about in this country. And then I began to see what was really happening with the terms of the regulation. And so from a personal perspective, it is probably the most rewarding issue that I have ever worked on as an advocate of any type, because I know that what we are doing is really changing people's lives and making a significant difference. Any chance that you have to get somebody off of a cigarette and onto a vaping product, we should be taking that and pushing it aggressively. And yet for the last 10, 15 years in this country, our public health establishment and our government regulators have basically been doing the exact opposite of that.
It really is crazy. So as I teed it up, as you and I were talking before the interview, I do like to let my listeners and viewers know a little bit more about the folks that I'm talking to sort of demystify and to talk a little bit about their outside interests. I almost did a podcast dedicated to that concept. When you're not doing this kind of work, when you're not practicing law, when you're not lobbying, advocating, what are you up to? What are some of those outside interests that you have?
Well, so I grew up in the Midwest, and I still live in the Midwest. My whole family is in the Midwest. I actually grew up in academic medicine. My father was one of our country's leading cardiologists. He built the Department of Medicine at the University of Iowa into a world-class scientific research teaching hospital. And so this was a world in which I lived, and actually at one point I thought I was going to be a doctor. I learned very quickly when I took chemistry in college that I was not going to become a doctor. But I did obviously find my calling, and when I'm not really exercising my calling, I do love to play guitar, and had a band in college. Actually, had a band in law school too. People question the judgment there, but I love music, and I love to play guitar. I'm also a rackets guy. Love playing almost any form of racket sport that's available to me. So whether it's tennis or paddle tennis in the winter or pickleball, that's how I really get out there. And try to stay healthy. And I love to travel. I have a wonderful family, 3 great kids, and a wife who's a former prosecutor who is, without question, the glue of everything that we do. And she's smarter than me, so it's really a nice blend. But
in that position, who's on your Mount Rushmore of guitarists? I mean, when you think about it, who do you always go back to?
I start with Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan. I'm a big Jimmy Page fan, and then I actually started playing. When I first started playing, I started playing classical. So Andre Segovia was just, obviously a completely different ilk, but just all masters.
One of my favorite LPs growing up of my parents. They had 2 Segovia albums that I wore down. I've never had an aptitude for it, and I've always wanted to either learn how to play guitar, learn how to play piano. But I bow down to folks who can. So I totally understand that. You'll appreciate this. Woke up when I got up this morning. The Last Waltz was on.
Wonderful.
Watched that as I was getting ready. Tony, how do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing?
Well, we have a website called www.vaportechnology.org. You can also follow us on social media, which is, I think our handle is @Vapor Tech Assoc. And that is really, I think, kind of one of the first places to go. We have a lot of the information that I've talked about with you today there. And we are really, really excited about the future, I got to tell you. I think that what's happened in this last election and the desire for change, the desire for disruption, the desire for really moving America forward, I think is something along all the themes that we talked about earlier, shows some real potential opportunity that we can break through this logjam, this ideological logjam, break through some of the moneyed interests that have been behind it, and really kind of give Americans a real shot at having a freedom to choose whatever flavored vape they want, and making sure that those products are scientifically sustained.
Yeah, listen, I couldn't agree with you more on that. There are some real opportunities there. I want to thank you very much for joining us today. My guest has been Tony Abboud. He is the executive director of the Vapor Technology Association. This, of course, brings us to the close. We got another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. If you're watching us on YouTube, go and check us out on one of those fine podcast platforms that you can take us with you there. If you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google or Amazon, you can watch us on YouTube as well. Leave a like, leave a comment, please subscribe, and let everybody you know about this. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.